There's a certain kind of rider who reads a race roadbook the way a general reads a map, looking not for where to survive, but where to strike. Ben Healy is that kind of cyclist. Built, it seems, specifically for the long, lonely road ahead of a peloton that can only watch him go. He wins by making everyone else's race irrelevant. He goes early, he goes alone, and more often than not, he goes all the way. He's 25 years old. He's already worn the yellow jersey at the Tour de France, and we're just getting started. These are the 4 wins that define Ben Healy. To understand Ben Healy, you have to start not at the Tour de France, not at the Giro, but at a relatively modest one-day race in northern Tuscany in the spring of 2023. The GP Industria, 199.8 kilometers. Not a monument, not a World Tour classic. A historic race that sits quietly on the calendar, gets a few lines of coverage, and sometimes is forgotten by the following week unless something extraordinary happens. Something extraordinary happened. The race finished on 4 large circuits around the town of Larciano, each one cresting the Fornello, a 2.7 kilometer climb at 6.4%. Not a mountain by any stretch, more of a sharp reminder that this is bike racing, and it's supposed to hurt. Enough gradient to string a group out, enough repetition to expose whoever was carrying tired legs, and enough descent on the other side to punish anyone caught in no man's land. A lead group of 16 riders had formed from the chaos of the peloton. Good riders, experienced riders. Diego Ulissi, who knew these Italian roads like the back of his hand. Mark Hirschi, the Swiss climber with a finishing kick to match his engine. Davide Formulo, Felix Grobschartner. UAE had sent 4 riders up the road, which meant they had the numbers to control the race and dictate how it ended. This was not a breakaway of also-rans. And then there was Ben Healy, 22 years old, still relatively unknown outside of inner circles, riding for EF Education EasyPost, the team who had become synonymous with aggressive, unpredictable racing. He was in the right place. On the final ascent of the Fornello, the race cracked open. Ulissi attacked, the logical move, the move everyone in the group had been anticipating. Healy went past Ulissi and through the top of the climb, and within moments, there was clear air between him and the group behind. 10 seconds on the descent, then 20 on the flat. The chase group behind him was fragmented and disorganized. Healy's lead crept up to 30 seconds with 3K to go. Felix, to his credit, launched out of the chase group and tried to bridge across alone. But Healy had too much road, too much time, and too much belief in what his legs were telling him. He crossed the line alone. It was his second win of the season. Most people watching were still working out exactly who he was. Within a few weeks, nobody would need to ask. Because before we get to the Giro, it's worth pausing on what happened in between. A run of Spring Classics performances that accelerated everything. The Amstel Gold Race, one of the most prestigious one-day races in the world, finishing in the Dutch hills after a day of relentless punchy climbing. Healy finished second, sandwiched on the podium between Tadej and Tom Pidcock, 2 riders who at this point were widely regarded as some of the top riders of their generation. And between them, the kid from EF, then Liège-Bastogne-Liège, the oldest classic in the calendar, 258 kilometers through the Ardennes. 4th place, and a race won by Remco Evenepoel. In that situation, finishing 4th is not a consolation, it's more of a statement. By the time the Giro start list was confirmed, Healy was more than a prospect. He was a threat, and he knew it. He arrived at his first Grand Tour with one objective, and he said so publicly: win a stage. Stage 8, with an uphill start before the road rolled for 150 kilometers. Then, on the finishing circuits, a short punchy climb with ramps pushing 10%, followed by a longer climb at 7.8 kilometers, before the short climb again, and a downhill run to the line. He got into the early move. 13 riders eventually clear, with the GC favorites content to let them go and watch each other. The break's advantage swelled to over 5 minutes. It was going to be a breakaway day. The only question was how it would play out. TJ Van Garderen, his sports director, had been thinking through options in the team car. Maybe use Barguil, who was in the break and motivated to move up the general classification as a foil. Let him do the heavy lifting on the climbs, then see what the reduced group looks like at the top. Healy threw the plan out completely. On the very first ascent, with 50 kilometers still to race, he attacked. Not at the top, not at the steepest section. He just went, and he went hard. And within moments, his breakaway companions were watching his back wheel pull away from them. Van Garderen pulled the car up alongside Healy, and realizing that any tactical conversation was now redundant, simply started calling corners, telling him when to ease on the pedals, warning him about the upcoming bends. Running a time trial by remote control with a rider who had decided, deep in his own head, that today was the day. The gap stretched. 1 minute, 2 minutes. His breakaway companions, who had ridden all day to get into a position to contest the stage win, were now racing for second place, and they all knew it. Healy crossed the finish line with over 2 minutes to spare, arms wide, grinning the grin of a man who had imagined this moment for months and then found out the reality was better than the dream. He was 22 years old. It was his first Grand Tour. He had just won a stage with a 50-kilometer solo attack. The sport had a new name to pay attention to. 2 years is a long time in professional cycling. Riders emerge, get found out, recalibrate, or fade. The question with a talent like Healy's was always whether the performances of 2003, of 2023, were a ceiling or a foundation. By the spring of 2025, the answer was becoming clear. The Tour of the Basque Country is one of the most demanding stage races on the calendar. 5 days through some of the toughest terrain in European cycling. The Basque climbs biting into riders' legs from the first kilometer. It's stage 5. Healy and his EF Education EasyPost teammate had worked their way into the day's breakaway, and the two of them put in shifts at the front, driving the pace over 4 categorized climbs, keeping the peloton at bay, managing the race from the front, as only riders with good legs and good heads can do, with 55 kilometers to go. A distance that would prompt most riders to think carefully, to weigh the odds, to ask whether they truly have what it takes to hold off a motivated chase for that long. Healy felt something shift. The tailwind was there. The legs were there. The moment was there. He went. 2 minutes opened up. The peloton, which had presumably thought the break would come back to them on the final run-in, found that it simply wasn't happening. Healy was not slowing down. He was not tying up. He was not looking over his shoulder with the desperate energy of a rider trying to outpace his own fatigue. He was just riding, steadily and mercilessly, putting one pedal stroke after another between himself and everyone else. When the finish line finally appeared, he glanced back once. Not in panic, more out of professional thoroughness, confirmed what he'd suspected for the last 20 minutes, and raised his arms. The Basque crowds, who know their cycling and who respect attacking racing above almost all else, erupted. Another solo win, another long-range move, another day when the race plan turned out to be very simple. Go early, go alone, and hold it. And then came the one that changes everything. The Tour de France is different. Every cyclist knows it, every fan knows it. The biggest race in the world, carried live into living rooms across the globe. Stage 6, through the rolling landscape of Lower Normandy. No summit finish, no famous mountain. On paper, it looked like a day for the sprinters teams to control, or perhaps for a breakaway to sneak through if the gaps in organization at the front could be exploited. Healy had this one circled before the tour started. He said so afterwards, and you believe him, because the way he described it, the flat to rolling terrain, the small categorized climbs, the long run-in, matches exactly the kind of stage he makes his own. He was aggressive from the very first kilometer, trying to get into the break, spending energy that looked, from the outside, almost reckless for so early in a 3-week race. The racing was frantic, the day was chaotic. Multiple attempts to establish a breakaway were shut down. Healy kept trying. And when the key move finally formed, after 130 kilometers of racing, he was in it. The break worked well together over the countryside. Riders from different teams, different nations, united temporarily by the shared need to keep the yellow jersey group behind them. They swapped turns, crested the small climbs, managed the time gap with the efficiency of riders who knew what they were doing and why. Then, 42 kilometers from the finish, on a road with no obvious launching pad, no mountain to use as cover, no reason between pure instinct and self-belief, Healy put his head down and went. 20 seconds became a minute. On the last categorized climb of the stage, the chase behind him fragmented. Nobody had the legs or the pace to bridge the gap, and Healy just kept opening up the road beneath him. He crossed the finish line 2 minutes and 54 seconds ahead of the next rider, alone, arms aloft at the Tour de France. But the stage win was only the beginning of that tour. On stage 10, Healy crossed the line third and pulled on the yellow jersey, becoming only the 4th Irish rider in the history of the race to wear it, joining Roche, Kelly, and Elliott in a list that reads like a Hall of Fame for a small nation that has punched impossibly above its weight in this sport for 60 years. He finished second on Mont Ventoux. He won the Super Competitivity Prize. He finished 9th overall. And through all of it, he kept attacking, kept going early, kept making the race difficult for everyone around him. He was 24 years old, and the Tour de France had a new name in its history books. There's a version of professional cycling that is deeply strategic, controlled, almost chess-like in his patience. And then there's Ben Healy, who looks at a roadbook, finds the section he wants, and goes to 50k early. What separates the great attackers from the merely good ones isn't just the willingness to go, it's the ability to sustain it. Anyone can attack from distance. Few can hold a 2-minute gap for 40 kilometers against riders chasing with everything they have. That takes a particular kind of engine, and an even more particular kind of belief in what that engine can do. Healy has both. The setting keeps changing. The method doesn't. He's only 25. There are a lot of breakaways and a lot of wins still to come. If you want more of the stories and riders that make professional cycling worth caring about, subscribe to 124 Cycling. New videos every week, covering the sport the way it deserves to be covered. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and we'll see you in the next one.